Here, I am the law." He smirked, his voice a mix of mockery and ownership. "Big bag like that? What are you carrying? Something not so clean?" He said it loud enough for the whole street to hear, and then slam! A shove, with no warning. He was no longer a cop keeping order, but a force unloading power onto a woman's face. Blood running down from her cheek, soaking through her collar. Seconds later, the once silent crowd began raising their phones, stepping closer. He started backing away, not because anyone shouted, but because, for the first time, the eyes around him were no longer looking away. In your state, how would this story end? Who would speak up? Leave a comment, because this time, the whole world is watching. The old convenience store sat tucked at the end of the street, its dusty glass reflecting the fading glow of sunset. Jordan Lane pushed open the door, and the soft chime above let out a quiet ring. She moved without hurry, the weight in her steps that of someone who had walked through more places than necessary. Her hood covered most of her face, but not the sharp awareness in her eyes, the kind that made anyone watching sense one thing clearly. She wasn't trying to draw attention, but she wasn't afraid if it came. Jordan walked between the narrow aisles, her hand brushing along the row of canned beans. Her sand-colored canvas bag swayed softly with her steps, worn and faded like it had followed her for years. She paused at the price board, her eyes scanning the numbers like reading a signal, then bent to check the expiration date. Every move was measured, precise, the manner of someone used to surviving in a place not meant for comfort. The back door swung open suddenly. Two officers just starting their shift stepped into the doorway, one thin and younger, his eyes darting like every corner might hold something to control. The other, larger, standing with a casual defiance, arms loose but eyes guarded. His name was Cole Strickland, and he had seen Jordan from the street, or more accurately had chosen to see her. Cole stood at the threshold, not because of any violation. There was no suspicious act, no dispatch alert had gone out, but something still made him walk in. The way she stood, the tilt of the bag on her shoulder, the way her eyes didn't scan nervously but looked straight ahead. It didn't fit the template he was used to. Custer, Cole's partner, didn't speak. He just kept his eyes on Cole, already knowing that once Cole took an interest, everything that followed would just be an excuse. Cole stepped forward a few paces and stopped about 10 feet from Jordan. He squinted, eyeing the worn canvas bag, resting quietly at her side, then said, "Big bag like that? What are you carrying? Something not so clean?" The words dropped like a slap in the air, loud enough for nearby heads to turn, yet empty enough to make clear it wasn't about behavior, it was about identity. A black woman, unfamiliar, in a small store, carrying an old bag, those alone built a charge with no need for evidence. Jordan raised her head. She didn't respond, but the look she gave him carried no surprise, no anger. It was flat, like a still surface of water that reflected his face more clearly than he expected. The moment didn't last long, but it drew a line, one he hadn't realized he'd crossed, and now couldn't control. Cole held his posture, eyes steady, partly because her silence made her harder to read, but mostly because he had never felt so observed by someone who hadn't moved. Jordan bent down and placed a can into the basket. Her hand didn't shake. The motion was deliberate, slow and intentional, and as she turned to the next aisle, something in the way she moved told Cole one thing plainly. His usual grip on the scene no longer held. He glanced at Custer, maybe looking for confirmation, but Custer's eyes were turned away, deliberately avoiding contact. In the stillness of the store, those nearby began to sense that a confrontation had settled in, not with shouting, not with clear cause. It came from a glance misread, a walk judged too quickly, and a question that never needed an answer. And though no one had moved another step, the space was no longer safe. Not for her, and not for him. Jordan did not take her eyes off the man in front of her. That silence, cast through a stare as unyielding as a mirror, frayed patience faster than any retort. Cole stood still for half a second, then shifted his hand slightly, as if to restate his stance, to remind everyone he was still the one holding control. But control had already changed hands the moment Jordan failed to react the way he expected. Custer glanced at his teammate, then back at Jordan. Her eyes no longer drilled into anyone, but she quietly observed the rack beside her. Yet the way she kept her back straight, not stepping an inch from where she stood facing Cole, said more than any response ever recorded in the system. In a room where authority usually hung from a belt and a name tag, that woman had thrown things off course by simply standing still with too much composure. Cole stepped forward again, closer than necessary. The personal space shrank, not from aggression but from intent. He stopped at a distance close enough to see if she would flinch. Jordan did not back away. She did not move forward either. That stillness said clearly, this was no challenge. It was a statement in silence that if someone intended to drag down another's dignity, they had better bring something stronger than a sneer. Cole inhaled softly, his finger tapping his thigh. A small gesture, but it revealed he was recalculating. The situation was not tilting the way he thought. Names, paperwork, reasons, the usual triggers of panic had not been mentioned. Yet a certain type of authority came not from ranks or signs, but from the ability to stay grounded under someone else's gaze. And that bothered him. Jordan moved for the first time since being questioned. She turned, picked up a box of tea, and studied the ingredients, as if no one stood behind her, as if Cole did not exist, as if no system was waiting for her to slip. She placed the box in her basket and walked to the next shelf. Cole said nothing, but his eyes shifted toward the fabric bag. He had no real intention of checking it. Not now. He just needed to reassert control over the conversation. But his last words had missed their mark, and that miss compelled him to pull the moment back with physical presence. "That bag looks pretty heavy," he said, this time in a low, deliberate tone. "You carry it like that often, or is today packed with stuff you'd rather not explain?" Jordan did not turn. Her voice came clear across the distance. "I carry what people shouldn't question with suspicion." She still faced the shelf, hand resting lightly on a packet of noodles, unmoving. Custer's hand brushed his belt. He no longer knew who he was watching, Jordan, who held firm to her boundary, or Cole, ready to cross it at the smallest sign of weakness. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shop window in soft pulses. Inside, silence clung to the air like a fine layer of dust, not irritating, but drying to the throat. Hands or words did not make the first touch. It was a closeness that had no place. A question designed to make someone bow, met instead with a stance held even firmer, an unbroken gaze under scrutiny, a posture that would not collapse beneath the pressure to conform. And maybe what unsettled Cole most was that he could not knock her off balance, because what he was trying to bend was not a woman with a shopping bag, it was something larger, the power to stand without permission, and that, to him, was the real threat. Jordan had just turned to walk away when the sound of shoes scraped against the tile behind her. It wasn't a sprint nor a chase. It was the kind of sound anyone who had ever collided with authority could recognize, the sound of being stopped. Cole stepped forward and raised a hand. It didn't touch her, but the gesture alone was enough to squeeze the air from the room. "Hold up a second," he said, his other hand already gripping a flashlight. The beam hit Jordan's face, direct, harsh, and unapologetic, like someone had just been dragged from an interrogation chair in a dark room with no cameras. Jordan stopped. She tilted her head slightly, shifting away from the beam, then turned to face him. Her entire face was now exposed under the artificial light, unpainted, unhidden, and unbothered. But her eyes, even in the brightest glare, held a cold depth that made the man in front of her swallow hard. "What are you looking for?" she asked, her voice steady and low. "A reason to put me down?" Cole pressed his lips, fingers tightening slightly around the flashlight. He didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially like that, a short question that flipped the scrutiny onto him, right in the place he thought he controlled. "I think it's necessary to check," he said firmly. "Don't see why. It's your attitude." Jordan raised an eyebrow without smiling, an attitude that gets a flashlight in the face like I'm a criminal. Custer still stood by the shelf of dry bread. His stance hadn't shifted, but his neck had tensed. He hadn't stepped in, but he hadn't stepped back either. His eyes moved between them, as if trying to pinpoint the moment when this would go too far. That gaze didn't offer agreement, nor did it offer intervention. It reflected something far more dangerous than protest, hesitation. Cole lowered the flashlight, but didn't switch it off. "Your bag's unusually heavy. You dodged the question. And this area's had incidents. I'm doing my job." Jordan didn't answer immediately. She shifted half a step to the side, creating space between herself and the counter. The motion wasn't threatening, but it wasn't a retreat either. Then she spoke, so softly the clerk farther away had to strain to catch it. "Your job is to protect civilians, not to grab whoever annoys you for any reason you feel like." The air inside the store suddenly thickened, like someone had thrown a punch without lifting a hand. Cole stopped smiling, his face stretched, not in calm, but in tension. The flashlight clicked off, but his grip on it stayed tight. His other hand hovered near his belt, close to the gun. Custer squinted, his body tilting slightly forward. He wasn't quite stepping in, but his instincts had started reacting to something his logic was still denying. This situation was slipping beyond control. Jordan locked eyes with Cole, still standing where she was. "Are you inspecting me?" she asked, "or proving that you can do it without needing a reason?" "The reason is your defiance," Cole snapped. "You made yourself a problem, not me." "So the problem is that I dared to push back?" she replied. "Or is it that you're not used to a black woman looking at you like she still has the right to ask questions?" Cole narrowed his eyes. The words had not been insulting, but they struck directly at what he relied on to function in that uniform. The habit of going unchallenged. He pressed his lips tightly and stepped closer. His stance was not quite threatening, but it was lining up. Custer took a slow step forward, just enough to establish a counterweight. He said nothing, but his gaze shifted. It now rested on between them. Jordan held her position. The silence after her last statement was not space, it was a boundary, and anyone who crossed it would no longer be checking a shopping bag. They would be stepping into a conflict of their own making. The air inside the shop seemed to have thickened. The beep of the barcode scanner at the checkout grew faint, then stopped. A clerk behind the counter ducked down, pretending to rearrange change in the drawer. A young woman a few meters away clutched her child, freezing in place, eyes flicking toward the two officers. A teenager near the bread shelf slipped his hand into his pocket, quietly pulling out his phone. He held it at hip level, thumb sliding across the screen as if checking messages, but the camera was already on. The angle was rough but clear enough. The flashlight in the officer's hand still beamed directly at a woman whose only visible reaction was calm. Jordan seemed to notice, but she neither glanced over nor avoided the lens. She stood her ground, eyes on Cole, lips pressed tight, hand clenching the strap of her bag as if weighing every breath. Cole caught the kid's movement. He half turned, chin tilting toward the small crowd just beginning to form. "Turn the phone off. This is a procedural check," he snapped, voice sharp, letting his irritation show. The words weren't aimed at anyone in particular, but loud enough for the whole shop to hear. The kid flinched slightly, but didn't comply. The others, though silent, sensed that the tension had shifted. An action being seen was one thing, an action being recorded was another, and Cole knew it. Jordan remained quiet, her gaze unchanged, but now she stood angled slightly toward the door, shoulder turned outward, as if she no longer wanted to be in the confines of that space. Cole stepped in close without a word, then suddenly pushed her shoulder, forcing her back toward the exit. The shove wasn't violent enough to knock her down, but firm enough to make a point. He wanted her out of sight, out of the attention beginning to gather. Jordan's heel hit the threshold, and a second later her back struck the glass as Cole gave another shove. No loud sound followed, no shouting, but every eye in the store had turned toward the door. Cole's move had not been accidental. He wasn't restraining someone resisting. He wasn't de-escalating a threat. He was pushing a woman out of the store because her presence disrupted his control. The moment Jordan stepped onto the sidewalk, she turned around, not to retaliate, but to look directly at him, a look calm to the point of unsettling. The look of someone who understood exactly what was happening and knew everyone else could see it too. An older man standing by the trash bin near the door stepped back and pulled out his phone. No one had to shout, "Record this." People had begun to understand that some moments, if not captured now, would be retold differently. And if no one preserved that moment, it would be rewritten by reports that left out the human weight. Custer stepped out of the shop a few seconds after Cole. He kept just enough distance not to be seen as intervening, but he was no longer an outsider either. His eyes moved toward the corner of the street, where a few cars had slowed down. Passers-by didn't yet know what was going on, but the glow of cameras held up from every direction was a clear signal that something was waiting to be exposed. Cole still held his posture of control. His hand rested on his belt, thumb hooked between the holster and the radio. It was a familiar stance, not calling for backup, not reaching for his weapon, but an unspoken reminder that he had the right to react however he chose. The problem was, this time, he was no longer the only one who would be telling the story afterward. And in those few breaths, as silence pulsed against the hot pavement of late afternoon, one thing had become clearer than any command. The man in uniform had created a confrontation he could no longer control. Not because Jordan had said anything, but because of what she didn't say. It was more than enough for everyone to start seeing it differently. And then came an unexpected act, one she hadn't anticipated. Jordan didn't have time to turn. Cole's next shove was no longer a warning or a veiled assertion of control. It was a full-blown strike, unfiltered and deliberate. Her back slammed into the rough brick wall beside the convenience store, the sharp crack echoing louder than the distance itself, like the silence of the bystanders had just been torn open. All motion froze for a split second. Jordan tilted her head, her back still pressed against the wall, her shoulder trembling briefly. Blood trickled from her right temple, trailing down her cheek. But instead of staggering or collapsing, as some might have expected, she raised her hand, wiped the blood with the back of it, and braced herself against the wall to push upright. No one spoke. Even the sound of traffic seemed to pause at the end of the street, and in that stillness, a voice rang out, young, clear, and stunned. "Mom!" They hit her. A small boy stood only a few steps away, still gripping his mother's sleeve. The woman flinched, pulling her son closer, eyes shifting from Jordan to the two officers. Her face was full of hesitation, not because she doubted what was happening, but because she didn't know whether speaking up would make things worse. Cole turned his head, his gaze slicing through the crowd like a blade. He didn't speak, but his expression alone made those holding phones wonder if they might be next. This time, though, his arm hung looser, no longer raised like before. Jordan lifted her head and looked directly at him. Her lips were stained with blood, but her eyes hadn't changed. No words were spoken. She simply inhaled and took one step forward, not to resist, but to remind everyone that she was still standing, still here, and that strike hadn't erased her from the narrative. A middle-aged man moved in a little closer, holding his phone up. He didn't say a word, but aimed the camera directly at Cole, openly, deliberately. That single gesture shifted the air. It was as if the invisible line between fear and decision had just been crossed. Custer remained still, but his eyes began darting, calculating risk. Stand with his partner or stand for what was right. He didn't ask it aloud, but the tension in his breath betrayed what the uniform could no longer conceal, a fracture from within. Jordan didn't back down. Her canvas shoes were dusty, her bag lay on the ground, its edge torn wide open. Every second she remained standing was a declaration, not of defiance, but of refusal to be reshaped into a threat. The child spoke again, this time whispering, "Why aren't they helping her?" A small question, but it made two nearby women exchange a glance. There was no discussion in it, only the spark of something slowly spreading, like the first crack in a strained window pane. Cole inhaled deeply, clearly trying to regain control, but what he hadn't anticipated was resistance from the woman in front of him. It was her deliberate stillness that had started shifting the crowd's mindset. And when a crowd begins to think, a uniform is no longer the only center of authority. Jordan never broke eye contact with Cole, but this time her voice rang out, low, steady, and crystal clear. "Do you even know who I am?" Cole raised an eyebrow, momentarily surprised, then let out a dry, mocking laugh, as if he had just heard an old joke. "Who you are doesn't matter," he said, his voice flat and pitched, louder than usual. "Here, I am the law." Custer, standing behind him, instinctively took half a step back. No one noticed, but he knew it himself. Something had just crossed a line he had once accepted as normal procedure. That line, meant to stamp authority, became the spark that hit an already gas-soaked air. The crowd began to shift. No one left. Their eyes locked on Jordan, on Cole, on every small gesture that normally went unseen. An older woman whispered to the person next to her. A young man raised his phone higher, aiming directly at Cole's face. No more secrecy, no more fear. Jordan did not move. She closed her eyes for a moment as if replaying a list of unforgivable things in her mind. When she opened them, the look was no longer one of someone who had been struck. It was the look of someone who had stood before closed courtrooms, faced people with power but no ethics, and survived. "What do you think law is?" she asked calmly. "A uniform? A gun? Or the power to silence others?" Cole lost his smirk. He turned to the crowd, then glanced at Custer, who had just broken eye contact. Something in his teammate's posture irritated him, but instead of reacting, he stepped forward slightly, pointing a finger at Jordan. "You're obstructing an officer. Now test me." "I'm not obstructing anything," Jordan replied. "I'm standing still, and you're the one turning your actions into wrongdoing. Don't pin that on me." A murmur rippled from the back. Someone said, "Did you hear that?" Maybe just a passing comment, but it was enough to make Cole snap his head around. He raised his hand to issue a warning, then stopped halfway. Something in the eyes of more than 10 people filming made him hesitate, something no gun or badge could command. Jordan finally bent down to pick up the bag she had dropped. The motion prompted someone in the crowd to ask, "What's happening here?" Custer looked at the speaker, then at Cole. A pause lasted 3 full breaths. He stepped toward Jordan, about to say something, but when he met her eyes that had seen through too many lies to be moved easily, he stopped. Jordan turned and walked away slowly, dried blood at her temple. She didn't look back, and Cole, though anger was climbing visibly across his face, did not raise his hand again, because for the first time in his entire shift today, he understood something the internal briefings never mentioned. Some people do not need to shout to make a system uneasy. Someone in the crowd said quietly, just loud enough to catch on the recording, "If she's someone real, then this was his worst move." No one replied, but the phone kept filming, and that video, minutes later, would travel far beyond the edges of a small neighborhood. Under the sunlight flickering through the convenience store's neon sign, Jordan reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small object. She didn't hold it high or shove it in Cole's face, just opened her palm at waist level, enough to reveal the scratched silver surface and the faded navy insignia deeply engraved on the metal badge. For a moment, the glint of light seemed to swallow the noise of the marketplace, and then, like an instinct fired before it could be restrained, someone in the crowd cried out, "Seal ID, what the hell are you doing?" The shout wasn't loud, but sliced through the thick tension like a blade. Several people immediately turned, phones in hand, no longer just recording, but beginning to document. Some squinted, trying to verify the emblem. Others stepped back, mouths slightly open, as if they'd just brushed against something forbidden. But perhaps the only one who didn't move was Cole. He stared at the badge, brows furrowing, his face twitching slightly, unclear whether from anger or confusion, before letting out a dismissive laugh. "You're not fooling anyone," he muttered, voice rough and dripping with sarcasm. "You sure look like a soldier." Even as he tried to raise his voice to mask the creeping doubt, Cole's throat was dry enough that each word hit like gravel. He scanned the area and spotted a woman live streaming, her hand still trembling. A young man had just stepped out of the store, stopped chewing his candy as he saw the silver badge. Something was shifting, an invisible current, not driven by threats, but by the presence of a truth no one had expected. Jordan didn't move. The silver badge rested in her hand like a living memory, not shown to prove anything, only to remind them that what they thought they controlled never truly belonged to them. Behind Cole, Custer shifted slightly. He looked at the badge, then at Jordan, then over at Cole. In that moment, what made him step back wasn't rank or truth. It was the realization that he had just witnessed something irreversible. He understood that if that truly was a SEAL badge, and everything in his gut told him it was, then the blow that had been delivered no longer fell under the shield of reasonable suspicion. It had crossed a line, and now someone would have to answer for it. A young girl, sitting behind her mother with a notebook shading her eyes, whispered, "Mom, what's a SEAL?" The question was innocent, but it made her mother shudder. She turned and answered firmly, "Someone who never has to yell to be respected." Near the store's entrance, the shopkeeper, an elderly Asian man, stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked at Jordan, then at the badge, and nodded slightly without saying a word. But his gaze was no longer that of a shopkeeper tired of trouble. It was the look of someone who had lived through moments when doing the right thing meant staying silent to avoid being swept away. And now he understood, maybe this time, silence was no longer an option. Cole flinched as a camera flash went off. He turned, reaching out to swat it away, but stopped halfway. Jordan was still standing there, saying nothing, and it was that silence that made every excuse in him feel suddenly hollow. He swallowed hard and looked back at Custer, as if waiting for his partner to confirm the gnawing suspicion now crawling down his spine. But Custer didn't nod, and in his eyes for the first time, Cole realized he could wear a uniform, hold a gun, and shout that he was the law. But in this moment, none of that could mask the truth now glaring back at him like a mirror. He had just struck someone who could make the entire system answer. Jordan tightened the strap of her bag, her gaze fixed on Cole, not with hatred and not with any hunger for victory. It was the look of someone who had been through enough battlefields to know that the most dangerous thing often wasn't bullets, but ignorance protected by a badge. "I don't need to prove anything," she said, her voice low and final, like sealing a classified report. "But you just did." She didn't turn away, nor did she glance at the camera now aimed at her. In that moment, Jordan's presence had moved beyond the idea of a victim. She stood there as a still point in the rupture of every assumption, now cracking wide open. Cole stood frozen, his right hand still in a reflexive, guarded position, but his shoulders had slightly slumped. He was used to confrontations that could be shut down with authority and a harsh tone, but the woman in front of him did not fit any of the patterns he knew. She did not cower, did not respond predictably, and refused to play the power game he was so practiced at directing. The silver badge was still in her hand, small, cold, and silent. Yet it had done what yelling, tears, or blood could not. It forced every eye back to her. Outside, an elderly man placed his grocery bag on a bench, holding his phone steady. A group of students just out of class stopped at the curb, and 3 of them pulled out their phones, exchanged glances, then started recording at once. It was instinct, as if they had recognized something bigger than the scene itself, something that needed to be documented, a system that never expected to be under the lens of its people. Custer shifted his shoulders, eyes scanning between Jordan, Cole, and the slowly tightening ring of onlookers. He knew he was standing on the wrong side, yet also knew that stepping back now would be seen as betraying the ranks. The conflict pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The question Jordan had just asked was not aimed at him, but it struck deep in that middle ground he had believed was safe, where choosing no side felt like safety. A teenager in a beanie whispered to his friend, "They just hit a SEAL." The words were not loud, but not hidden either, and like a chain reaction, those nearby began to pass it on. In less than a minute, the corner of the street turned into a buzzing hive, not from rage, but from shock. The phones no longer dropped after a few seconds. They tracked every movement, not to catch drama, but to confirm that this had happened. Cole looked around, and for the first time, he did not feel in control. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat locked. He turned to Jordan, lips pressed tight, then suddenly snapped, "I don't care who you are, we're following procedure." But his voice came out wrong, as if he knew no one believed that anymore. Jordan said nothing. She quietly folded the silver badge and slipped it into her pocket. No explanation, no threat, no demand for justice. Because of what she had just done, standing tall after being struck, revealing the badge at the right moment, not challenging but letting the truth surface, was how she made an entire city look at itself. And this time the cameras did not stop, because in the dim light of what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, what was being captured was not just a confrontation, but the moment a system was forced to face itself. Jordan slowly bent down and picked up the torn canvas bag from the ground. One hand gripped the strap while the other pulled out a scratched phone. With a practiced thumb, she swiped through a familiar sequence and dialed a number not saved under any name, not stored in any contact list. When the voice on the other end picked up, she didn't offer an introduction or a greeting, just 3 words, short, final, like an encrypted command. Echo 6, Delta. Then she hung up. She stayed where she was, not explaining to the crowd, now stirring with whispers, nor did she look back at Cole or Custer. From the moment the silver badge appeared, everything around her seemed pushed aside. The air thickened, a silent anticipation spreading through every glance, every murmur. Cole tried to maintain his arrogant expression, but the veins in his neck began to show, as if even he could sense that something was coming. Something he couldn't predict. 6 minutes passed. No one left. No one dared to break the silence. Then, from the far end of the street, a sound emerged, not a siren, but the low hum of a heavy-duty SUV engine. The jet-black, unmarked vehicle pulled in like a shadow, gliding. The door opened. No loudspeakers, no warnings. No one stepped out from the driver's seat. A man in plain clothes exited from the back. He was tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a calm that wasn't the kind trained in civilian law enforcement. His shirt collar was unbuttoned, but he wore a short ID tag, a thin sheet of metal, silver in color, engraved with a Pentagon insignia and a code that belonged to no police unit. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't ask questions. He walked directly toward Jordan, stopped 1 arm's length away, and gave a slight nod. "We've been monitoring," he said, voice calm to the point of coldness, like someone who had been in a command center miles away and only just arrived to confirm. His eyes swept briefly over Cole, then Custer, before resting on Jordan. "Direct orders. You're being escorted." Cole's brows furrowed, and he took a step forward. "Hold on. Who is he? This is my patrol zone." His voice was hoarse, yet still clinging to the last threads of authority. The man didn't respond. He pulled from his pocket a device no larger than a car key, tapped it lightly. A small LED shifted from red to green, followed by a soft ping. "Identity confirmed," he said, this time directing his words toward the still recording cameras. "Ms. Lane is not under investigation. Any further actions will be escalated directly to the Department of Defense." At that, the crowd nearly held its breath. A teenage girl whispered, "Holy shit," while the elderly man from earlier gave a quiet nod. The truth was unfolding plainly before them, not a rumor, not an unverified report. A soldier, someone from a tier of society most people had only heard of but never seen, was now standing in front of them, not raising a weapon, not raising his voice, yet carrying with him a system so vast that all authority on the ground seemed to dim by comparison. Custer said nothing, but inside him was a silent crisis. What he had been trained for, what he had long believed in, was being stripped away. And now he realized what the uniform never taught. There are limits that procedures cannot cover, and when military authority itself begins to speak, there is no room left for excuses. Jordan gave a slight nod to the man from the Pentagon, then turned to the crowd. "I'm fine," she said simply, but the way she said it, along with the presence of her escort, turned those words into a signal. Not just reassurance, but confirmation that the situation had shifted. And from that moment on, no one filmed out of curiosity. They filmed because they knew this time the truth would not be cut short. Cole stood upright, as if stretched taut by an invisible wire, his face flushed, a sheen of sweat forming at one temple. His eyes tried to look firm, but could not hide the unease, as if he had just realized the line between what he called routine authority and the truth had been exposed. Meanwhile, the crowd, people who had seen many encounters between civilians and police, was completely silent. No shouting, no outrage, just breathless quiet. And that silence was the clearest sign that trust was shifting. The phone cameras were still raised, but no longer held at chest level to hide. Every lens pointed straight at Cole, a man who once believed wearing a uniform and speaking with enough force was all it took to control any scene. Now he was not facing physical resistance, but something harder to contain. A witness. Jordan did not turn her back. She looked at Cole one last time, neither smiling nor angry, her gaze heavy like a carving in stone. Then she spoke, calm but loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "If there were no cameras today, I'd probably be tomorrow's headline." The words landed in the air like a sharp blade, clean and without force. Custer, still standing just behind, bowed his head slightly, unsure if it was from exhaustion or the thought of those familiar morning news segments, blurry footage, the words investigating the cause, and a victim reduced to an old photograph. Jordan's voice accused no one, but forced everyone to picture the outcome she had just narrowly avoided, thanks to one small act by a stranger who dared to pull out a phone and not look away. The man with the Pentagon badge opened the SUV door. Jordan walked toward it, the gravel crunching under her canvas shoes, her steps slow but steady. The worn bag swung lightly at her side, the last visible trace of an identity that had once been questioned. Before getting in, she turned one more time, not toward Cole, but toward the boy who had spoken up earlier. She gave a small nod, then disappeared into the vehicle. The door shut with a solid click. No one moved. People stood still, as if needing a few more seconds to absorb what had just happened. A middle-aged man who had not said a word the entire time slowly lowered his phone and exhaled deeply. "For the first time," he murmured, "someone survived without having to scream they were innocent." Cole remained still, but now his hands were clenched at his sides. The sweat on his face was no longer a sign of heat or fatigue. It was the result of a balance of power that had just been flipped. On the radio, clipped to his chest, the dispatcher's voice reminded him to check another route. But Cole did not respond because he knew there would be reports to file, cameras to review, and this time, there was no way to edit over the footage with an explanation. Custer finally moved. He took one step back, eyes still fixed on the space where the SUV had vanished. In his mind, one question repeated. When did doing the right thing start making people break a sweat? A young woman in the crowd stepped forward and said to the person beside her, "If this was the first time he got recorded, maybe it's the last time he stands in that spot." The person did not answer, just nodded, eyes still following the direction where the black car had gone. The street still held the traces of chaos, but this time people did not pass it like a scar that could not be changed. They stayed, they watched, and they remembered, not because it was shocking, but because it reminded them of something simple. Sometimes, the reason someone survives is that someone else didn't look away. The 8-minute video capturing the entire incident at the convenience store began spreading at breakneck speed. Within just 24 hours, the view count soared into the millions, surfacing across every platform from mainstream social media to military forums. But what drew attention wasn't the number of views, it was the reaction. This time, there were no sides, no was the cop right or wrong debates, but a different kind of silence. Deep, prolonged, and heavy. A hashtag began to rise beneath every reshared clip. What if she wasn't Special Forces? The question wasn't aimed at criticizing Jordan, but pointed squarely at the system. Countless comments echoed internal conflict. Did her SEAL badge save her life? Not the fact that she was a human being? Some posted screenshots of Jordan standing up, blood still wet on her forehead, writing, "That calm didn't come from training. It came from knowing if she flinched, they would win." Veteran communities started to weigh in. A short clip taken from a podcast hosted by a former U.S. Marine showed him speaking slowly, each word like a crack through faith in justice. "We weren't trained to beat civilians, but they're allowed to beat soldiers." That line spread just as fast as the original footage and was quickly quoted on late-night news broadcasts. A recorded radio conversation among former special operatives was replayed in black and white. No music, no editing, just real voices. If a SEAL can be taken down like that in the street for no reason, then who among us is safe? We spilled blood overseas to protect the law. And back home, the law becomes a club in the hands of those who don't need a reason to strike. A group of law students in Minnesota launched an online campaign calling to reopen files of past controversial use of force cases with a central question. If the victim that day hadn't been Jordan Lane, but a black mother out grocery shopping, would the cameras have turned on in time? And this time, more than a few politicians found themselves pulled into the conversation. Several representatives who had stayed silent in previous incidents were now forced to speak, not out of will, but because public pressure left them no choice. Jordan made no media appearance. She gave no statements, wrote no posts, and did not reshare the video. Yet people began to see her image in self-defense classes, where instructors emphasized a new lesson. Calm isn't a weapon. It's what helps you survive in a world where anger can be misread as a threat. The next morning, early news shows simultaneously rebroadcast the footage from the convenience store, each with a different narrative lens. But what baffled the newsrooms most wasn't the clip. It was how to name the central figure. On screen, Jordan Lane's image appeared beside a headline dangling in ambiguity. Retired operator pushed from store. Action over the line. Some editors trimmed details, calling her the woman stopped by police without cause, but at the end of every script, no one could find a title that fit. Victim sounded too passive for the truth, while resistor distorted the tone entirely. One local station tried calling her the survivor of an abuse of power, but even that only partially fits. Jordan didn't plead, didn't beg, didn't hide behind the aftermath. She couldn't be placed in a box of helplessness. Yet she also didn't posture or provoke, and that made the event difficult to frame. The woman in the video had forced the system to look at itself without ever raising her voice. An evening commentary program opened with the question, if someone does not resist, does not break the law, and still gets shoved into a wall, then what is she in this story? The question echoed in the studio and bounced back to the host himself, forcing him to pause for a few seconds before continuing. That hesitation was not about information, it was about language. In a society accustomed to preset categories, Jordan fit into none of them. And when language fails, people begin to realize that what is unsettling is not the act, but the response of someone who refuses to behave as expected. In political newspapers, most articles avoided bold conclusions. Some referred to her as a brave former operative, while others left out her background altogether, only noting a woman who remained calm after confrontation. But the more they sidestepped, the clearer the question became. Why is it so hard to name someone like her? Maybe it is because we are used to naming only those who have either fully surrendered or fully rebelled. On social media, the conversation shifted. Amid the outrage, an anonymous account posted a short tweet. She survived not because of her rank, but because someone dared to record. The line was shared nearly 500,000 times within 8 hours. No image, no hashtag. But it made people pause, because it did not glorify Jordan or condemn anyone. It pointed to the very axis of the entire story, the right to be seen and to be a veteran journalist commented on that post with a single sentence. Without video, they would have rewritten her as an uncooperative obstructionist. That comment caught the attention of media professionals, and soon editorial teams began re-examining the language in their broadcasts. Some outlets changed their headlines, dropping the phrase controversial incident, replacing it with a moment that forced institutional reflection. Meanwhile, Jordan made no statements. She did not appear in public, did not post a response, did not demand an apology. And that silence added to the media's discomfort, because modern news systems run on reaction. When there is no comment, no lawsuit, no tearful press conference, what remains is the raw content, a person who stayed silent and a society unsure how to explain it. The story did not end with a video or a shove. It redefined what resistance looks like, not through action, but through presence. And when that presence does not fit any label, It begins to form a language of its own, one where every question must be rewritten, starting with how we see others, not by their roles, but by their dignity. The summons from the Internal Oversight Division didn't surprise Custer, but the timing did. There was no warning from his superiors, no prior notice to the patrol unit, just a brief email with 2 lines, requesting his presence at 8 o'clock the next morning in the interrogation room of Administrative Zone 3. No specific reason was given, but after the video went viral and the Pentagon responded, he knew the matter had moved beyond a shove. The room where he sat didn't look much different from the routine evaluation spaces he had known. Pale gray walls, metal chairs, a chipped wooden table, and a voice recorder already running. Across from him sat an older woman, her hair tied neatly, her eyes not harsh, but unwilling to let anyone slip through without honesty. She didn't state her name or rank. She began with one sentence, "I want to hear everything, from the beginning." Custer nodded, took a deep breath, and began recounting. He left nothing out. He spoke of when they both entered the store, Cole's first glance, the baseless, mocking remarks, and how he could sense his partner had already identified Jordan as a threat, not because of anything she did, but because her composure made him feel out of control. Custer described even the sharpest silences, the unspoken exchanges loaded with tension, and finally, the shove that sent Jordan into the brick wall. Everything he said aligned with the public video, but this time included what the camera couldn't capture: the tightness in his throat, the pressure in his chest, the way he looked away when he saw blood trickling down her temple. The woman nodded slowly when he finished. She didn't ask a follow-up immediately. Instead, she paused the recorder, opened a thin file folder, and pulled out a photo, not of Jordan, but of a black teenage boy around 16, with a bruised eye, split lip, and blood-matted hair. She placed the photo on the table, slid it toward him. This boy was hospitalized 3 months ago. His name is Tyrell Dawson. He claimed a police officer choked him unconscious outside an auto shop, but he couldn't remember the man's face clearly. Have you heard about this case? Custer stared at the photo longer than necessary. He nodded slightly, then lowered his head. I was there that day. I saw it. Her expression didn't change. What did you see? Custer's voice dropped. Cole. He pinned Tyrell's neck down on the hood with his elbow. The boy was struggling, said he couldn't breathe. I was a few meters away. I heard everything. And what did you do? Her voice wasn't raised, but it tightened the room. I stayed silent. I didn't intervene. I thought if I spoke up, I'd be kicked off the team. That position isn't easy to get back. His last words came quieter, as if he knew even then they weren't worth defending. The woman leaned back, her eyes no longer on him, but through him. Then she leaned forward again, both hands on the table, and asked with a colder tone than before, "And what are you willing to lose now to keep staying silent?" It wasn't a moral test. It was a warning that the system was turning inward. And this time, those who remained quiet would fall with it. There was no room left for neutrality. Custer understood. The air felt heavy, as though every decision he had delayed was demanding to be paid at once. He raised his head, voice dry and resolute. I don't want to stay silent anymore. And if that costs me my job, I accept that. I just don't want to look back again and know someone else paid for my cowardice. The woman took no notes. She simply reached out, restarted the recorder. Are you willing to say that in front of the disciplinary board? Custer nodded. With every detail they need. The recorder blinked red. The room returned to silence. But inside Custer, what had just been activated was not a device. It was a choice, buried for 3 years, now resurfacing, along with consequences he knew would not be easily avoided. Custer bowed his head before the committee. No one asked him to. No cameras were recording that moment, but those sitting across from him understood. It was not the gesture of someone confessing guilt, but the action of someone stepping beyond the final threshold of immunity, when silence was no longer a livable option. That same afternoon, an internal notice was sent through the system. An official investigation had been launched, but this time not led by the local police internal affairs unit. A cross-agency legal team, including representatives from the Department of Justice, the Office of Human Rights Oversight, and a civilian watchdog agency appointed directly by the state governor's office officially took over the case. It was an unprecedented move in the region's history, not due to the severity of the incident, but because of the systemic nature of what was now under scrutiny. There was no grand press conference. No promises of reform, just a leaked internal document showing that at least 12 files had been previously removed from formal review, all tied to similar misconduct, including 2 cases where Cole Strickland was listed as the responding officer. One of those files matched the timeline of Tyrell Dawson's hospitalization for a fall of unknown cause. The information spread not through television, but through internal networks, legal forums, and former officer communities. People did not share it with outrage icons or hashtags, but by quoting exact lines from Custer's testimony. Each detail was a crack in a wall of trust stretched too far. A local newspaper, known for its conservative stance, unexpectedly published the full transcript of the exchange between Custer and the investigator. In the caption, they offered no judgment on whether his action was betrayal or awakening. They simply wrote, "No one is blameless who witnessed and stayed still." That evening, an independent outlet with a small readership but wide influence in activist circles ran a bold headline. "Silence used to be safety. Now it is evident." The words appeared in bold against a white background, no images attached, and became the symbol of a deeper shift. Not through policy, but through awareness. Citizens no longer saw a silent officer as a neutral figure. They saw it as a deliberate act of complicity. The article opened with a short paragraph. When one officer says what everyone suspected, the question is not why did he speak, but why didn't all the others before him? The writer did not use an accusatory tone. He did not name names. He simply listed cases closed for lack of witnesses, lack of evidence, or insufficient grounds to reopen. And he ended with the question, if someone had spoken up in those cases, how many people might still be alive to tell their story? Custer did not finish the article, but a printed copy was left on his desk by a colleague. During a break, he quietly picked it up, read the headline, then set it back down. No one asked what he thought. No one patted his back. But from that afternoon, he was no longer as isolated as he had imagined. A mid-ranking officer who had stayed silent during the last 3 meetings invited him for coffee. A senior-year intern asked to see the transcript of the internal interrogation to better understand how the system works from the inside. These small gestures were not forgiveness. They were signals that he had chosen the right moment to stop avoiding the truth. Outside the station, someone quietly taped that headline to a street lamp, beneath a photo of Jordan. Silence used to be safety. Now it is evident. No one took it down. No one argued, because for the first time in many years, the police force itself was being asked to hear what it had always told others. Words have value only when placed beside action. And from now on, that action begins with not looking away. 3 days after the official investigation was announced, a previously unseen video suddenly surfaced online from an anonymous account. The footage was grainy, slightly shaky, but the audio was chillingly clear. It captured the moment when Jordan was pinned against the brick wall, precisely when Cole closed in from behind. And in those few seconds that many had assumed contained only brute force, his whisper emerged, distinct, unfiltered, needing no audio enhancement. A black woman standing tall? Really? There was no screaming. No loud verbal abuse is typical of viral clips, just a hissed sentence, low enough to escape any nearby microphones but sharp enough to expose the encounter's true nature. Not suspicion, not a procedural response, but systematized contempt, where gender and skin color are boxed into an unspoken template of submission. Everyone understands, even if no one names it. That one line erased every justification. The video quickly spread across multiple platforms, accompanied by a brief caption, audio extracted from a civilian's recording device. No one confirmed the identity of the recorder. No one took credit for the upload. But this time, no one questioned whether it had been edited or staged. The cadence, breath, and the subconscious recoil in Cole's posture after speaking all matched exactly with his behavior in earlier footage. Within 4 hours, the sentence, "A black woman standing tall, really?" appeared in every major headline. No fewer than 30 op-eds were published simultaneously across national outlets, each from a different lens, sociological, linguistic, behavioral, but all converging on one truth. Prejudice doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be whispered by someone in power at the exact moment the vulnerable can't respond. On social media, community pages changed their banners to black backgrounds with white text. That sentence explains the whole system. Those who had defended law enforcement went quiet. Others who had hesitated to share the video now reposted it with captions like, "No more excuses." An analysis by a black scholar from the University of Michigan drew over 1 million reads in 12 hours, with a piercing line. What angers us isn't just the sentence. It's the fact that it was spoken with such ease. Veteran forums that had once argued for Cole's neutrality offered no defense this time. A group of retired Special Forces operatives even issued a public statement. "If this is who once stood beside us, then we withdraw our association. No one gets to spit on someone's dignity in the name of justice." In high school, students began printing the sentence on T-shirts, not to spread hate, but to remember that something unacceptable truly happened in a city considered stable. An English teacher in Connecticut included the clip in a lesson on metaphor, power, and coded speech, leaving the classroom silent after viewing. When asked, "How do you feel?" one girl replied, "That question's not for us. It's for the people who think silence doesn't hurt." Investigative bodies were forced to widen the scope. The sentence was no longer a side detail. It had become psychological evidence, a kind of confession without interrogation. A representative from the Office of Human Rights Oversight said in a closed-door briefing, "If those words were spoken voluntarily, they represent motive. And that motive is no longer about questionable judgment, it's about institutionalized bias." Jordan remained silent, but no one demanded her response anymore, because what needed to be heard had already been said by someone who never thought he'd be recorded. And from that moment on, the investigation no longer asked, "What happened?" It asked, "What made a man believe he could say that and still live undisturbed within this system for so many years?" Following the viral spread of the discriminatory clip, the mayor's office received hundreds of emails, petitions, and messages demanding an official response. Among them was a handwritten letter with slightly tilted penmanship sent by an 8th-grade girl. No grand declarations, no dramatic phrasing, just one simple opening line. "I'm scared to grow up and be seen as a threat, just because my skin looks like hers." The letter was transcribed word for word, posted on a high school bulletin board, then widely circulated online, untouched. The girl wrote that after watching the clip, she no longer felt safe going to the bookstore with her mom, felt free to laugh loudly in school hallways, and sometimes wondered whether holding her head high when called by name might be labeled resistance. She no longer knew what definition was right, because what happened to Miss Jordan felt like a reminder that girls like her weren't allowed to stand tall in public. Your letter was shared by many teachers, parents, and community organizers. No one corrected the grammar or reworded your thoughts. They understood the power wasn't in how it was written, but in the truth that a 13-year-old had to learn too early. It wasn't about systems or power. It was about fear creeping into childhood when avoiding becomes survival. Though mainstream channels refused to air the clip, citing unverified legal audio, it still spread fast. In 12 hours, the video was everywhere, from academic sites to student groups. Some teachers played it to start civics lessons, showing how words can carry harm without violence. In working-class neighborhoods, people talked about it not from shock, but recognition. Elders remembered when a frown could get someone questioned. Young people were angry because that voice sounded rehearsed, like it had always been waiting to strike when no one could fight back. No headlines, no music, just a whisper at the right time turned into the loudest voice. It shifted things from reaction to reckoning, with bias never written into law but lived every day. in every patrol, every assumption made before a word was spoken. That evening, the police chief was called into a closed meeting. No cameras, no press. An hour later, the news confirmed his resignation, not for defending Cole, but for failing to stop a culture of bias. He had once been seen as a reformer, but when a statement like that came from one of his own, and wasn't rare, no one could look away anymore. And a spokesperson said, "This isn't personal. No one should lead if they can't stop harm from becoming routine." That sentence made it clear. The crisis wasn't about one man. It was about whether a system was willing to change. And this time, change began with truth breaking through walls no longer thick enough to hide. As the investigation widened, people began tracing the trail of forgotten decisions and files that had been closed, with reasons like insufficient evidence or not enough grounds for prosecution. One name appeared repeatedly in the reports: Thomas Denham, a former city police commissioner who had held his position for nearly 2 decades and was known for his extensive influence in departmental personnel decisions. What made the name stand out wasn't just his former role, but another detail that had just been confirmed. He was Cole Strickland's father-in-law. The family tie had been concealed, never listed in public HR documents. But when cross-referenced with internal files and marriage records, the missing piece became clear. A series of complaints that had been dismissed during Denham's tenure, mostly involving Cole's misconduct and excessive force, were now being re-examined. At least 4 audio recordings submitted by citizens and junior officers had been filed with the Internal Affairs Division, yet none led to disciplinary action. Some recordings weren't even given case numbers, stored instead in folders labeled "not prosecutable," with no accompanying meeting minutes. As public pressure mounted, a team of federal investigators was dispatched to the police department's digital archive, where hundreds of terabytes of legacy data sat untouched on servers that hadn't been updated in nearly a decade. From there, they recovered numerous recordings, mislabeled or placed in the wrong directories. One particularly notable clip captured a conversation between a young officer and an internal investigator, in which the officer described Cole striking a teenage suspect on the head with a gun stock. The investigator's reply at the time: "I'd advise you to tread carefully. This isn't someone you want to challenge." Other recordings revealed a sophisticated culture of shielding, not through forged evidence, but through systemic silence. Those who considered speaking up were reassigned or suddenly received poor performance reviews. The cover-up didn't originate from a single command, but from an ingrained culture operating through subtle warnings, quiet threats, and professional trade-offs. One of the most chilling discoveries wasn't the number of offenses, but the number of warnings sent up the chain, only to be quietly filed away in locked drawers. When news broke that Cole's protector had been identified, the online community called it the final shadow brought into light. Civil rights groups began organizing panels, discussions, and exhibits showcasing investigative documents to illuminate the truth. And in all of these events, Jordan Lane's name held a place of honor. She was invited to speak at an international forum on justice and equality. A university offered her an honorary citizenship award. The state's Human Rights Council proposed a Medal of Courage for facing injustice with calm and integrity. But Jordan declined them all. No dramatic statements, no public rebuttal, just a short note to the organizers with one sentence: "I'm not here to be rewarded for surviving." That line was shared across every platform without any photo. No image was needed to glorify or symbolize her. Jordan gave no emotional speeches, stepped onto no stages of praise, but her refusal became the clearest reminder. A just system shouldn't need survivors to prompt change, and someone being alive shouldn't be a reason to celebrate, but a warning that they nearly weren't. Among the many who rose from crisis, Jordan chose a role few would witness: not a spokesperson, not because she lacked the power to inspire, but because she understood that true justice doesn't come from ceremonies. It comes from someone willing to face what's wrong before it becomes accepted history. And for her, standing up wasn't about being named. It was to ensure no one had an excuse to forget those once silenced. for not being memorable enough. A few days after Jordan turned down all honors, a veteran journalist, known for interviewing top political figures, asked to meet her with just one question. They met at a quiet cafe, no cameras, no recording. Jordan showed up on time, in a plain jacket, no makeup, carrying a worn notebook. After brief pleasantries, he asked, "If you won't accept awards or speak publicly, what do you want to leave behind?" Jordan paused, set her cup down, looked out the window at an old woman crossing the street with her grandchild, then said calmly, "A question. Each person must answer for themselves." The journalist waited for more. She said nothing else. Her answer didn't invite debate. It ended the exchange and made it impossible to forget. The next day, in a piece titled, "We Owe Her an Answer," he wrote, "I've asked many what they want to leave. Most say ideals or legacy. She left only a question, and I saw it. Real change starts not with lessons, but with a moment that forces us to ask, would I have stood still? After that, Jordan vanished from public view. No statements, no posts, no more interviews. A media rep confirmed she didn't disappear from fear. She believed she'd said enough. Yet silence didn't erase her. It amplified her impact. Schools updated civics lessons. Law students formed forums. In a distant city, police reviewed language bias after one teacher read about her in class. No one said her name loudly, but in essays, students mentioned the woman who walked out without bowing. In police trainings, instructors asked, if you were there, what would you do? In closed-door meetings, one example returned. Jordan Lane. She didn't need the spotlight. What she left was quiet, lasting. And now, with every person who asks, could I stay calm like her? A system begins to learn justice again, not through rules, but through how we choose to see. Those who had once witnessed acts of abuse began rewriting their stories. Not for media attention, not to provoke public interest, they simply wrote, then shared them in small groups, on closed platforms, or sent them directly to legal aid organizations. Many of them had never imagined they would speak up. Some were truck drivers searched on the highway without cause. Others, nurses detained at airports just for speaking in accents that didn't match regional expectations. Some had stayed silent for fear of being mistaken as troublemakers. Others simply thought, my story's too small, no one would care. But now they looked back and realized it was that very smallness, repeated over and over, that made the system confident it never had to change. Their accounts weren't filled with rage. Most were matter-of-fact descriptions, step by step, glance by glance, gesture by gesture, of how they were made to feel diminished without having done anything wrong. They didn't tell their stories to reclaim something lost. They told them so that no one else would have to live with that feeling again. Among the most widely cited excerpts was a handwritten note on lined school paper, penned by an 80-year-old man. He sent it to a local community counseling center, unsigned except for 2 words. Still here. 40 years ago, I was asked to stand against a wall for inspection because my coat was too big. They didn't hit me, they didn't yell, but they kept me there for nearly half an hour, without reason, without apology. I told my wife. She said, they probably made a mistake. Don't dwell on it. I believed that, until now. Now I understand. They didn't need to hurt me, they just needed me to believe I deserved it. That note came without images, without hashtags, but it spread faster than the most sensational headlines because it touched a collective memory deeply known by anyone who had lived through it. The feeling of having to quietly accept mistreatment simply because the person doing it wore something official. Young people didn't react with tears or fury. They read it and folded it quietly, as if passing on a flame that had never gone out. One literature teacher shared, some stories don't need drama, they just need one honest sentence that makes others examine their reactions. At a high school in a district rarely linked to enforcement violence, something unexpected happened during a civics class. The topic was rights and responsibilities, a standard curriculum, taught for years. But when the teacher mentioned the right to remain silent when questioned by authorities, a girl suddenly raised her hand and stood. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think we're taught enough about the right to stay silent without being suspected. The classroom fell silent. She stood tall, hands clasped, her gaze steady, as if she had thought through every word. The teacher looked at her for a few seconds, then set his pen down. He didn't push back. He asked, "Where do you think we should start over?" She answered, "Where people stop being judged for standing still." The moment never made headlines. No one filmed it, no one posted about it. But in the following week, the school hosted an optional seminar titled "The Right to Remain Silent and the Limits of Passive Defense." Nearly half the student body signed up. A principal from a neighboring district, upon hearing the story, quietly wrote on a sticky note pinned to his office wall, "Not being suspected, just for not reacting," because he understood that when a generation begins questioning how the system treats silence, it's no longer just a civics lesson, it's an awakening. And like that, the crescendo ended, not with applause or formal closure, but with someone, somewhere, beginning to speak. No interviews, no banners, just a refusal to look away. And sometimes, that is the most durable beginning to change. On a Monday morning in a district less than 40 minutes from downtown, a resignation letter appeared on the local police captain's desk. It came from Tyler Raines, 35 years into the force. No press, no speech, just one line on a folded note. "I joined to protect justice, not to refine it by skin color." No one was surprised. Raines had long questioned training methods and quietly objected to calling black neighborhoods watch zones, but he stayed silent until Jordan's video, and then Cole's recording, made him see his silence had gone too far. He wasn't a man of statements. He worked quietly, never broke the rules, but lately the way he wore his uniform had changed. Less pride, more weight. The note wasn't an attack, it was a choice from someone no longer willing to betray why he started. Online, the note spread quickly. No one edited it, just the plain text. Blue ink, no corrections. It struck a chord, not because Raines was known, but because many had once believed the same, then lost sight of it. Change followed quietly. A bus driver stepped in for a student, a clerk refused to alter a report, a teacher added race to class talks, a librarian moved civil rights books to eye level. No protests, just people choosing not to look away. And in that choice, the unseen began to be seen, not for proof, but for presence. One cafe shelf held a note. "Some things don't need to be shouted. Enough people not looking away is loud enough." The streets, the only officers to ask, survived the night, and were here to help as dashly as the clerk. One cafe shelf held a note, "Some things don't need to be shouted. Enough people not looking away is loud enough." 2 weeks after Jordan disappeared from the media, a middle-aged man arrived at the small apartment she was renting, carrying a sealed envelope and a calmness that made it clear he wasn't curious. He introduced himself as a Pentagon advisor who had worked on domestic counterterrorism. No card, no questions. He simply placed the envelope on the table and said almost apologetically, "We can't release the file, but there's another way to let people know." Inside wasn't a classified document, but a photo from an aerial surveillance camera, grainy but clear. Jordan, in fatigues, with a local police officer pointing a gun at her head. Her hands were raised, unarmed, eyes steady. The officer didn't recognize her unit because what she was doing wasn't shared with local agencies. It was a moment that never made any official report. The advisor said little more. He knew Jordan couldn't file a complaint, couldn't speak, couldn't even write it down. But he also knew that what people thought was her first confrontation had happened before, and revealing that could shake the entire system. Jordan held the photo and said quietly, "So I wasn't imagining it." Then, for the first time in 3 years, she began to tell the story. Not for revenge, but so no one else would have to pretend it never happened. 3 years earlier, while embedded in an armed extremist group in the Midwest, Jordan had to exit urgently through an emergency extraction point over 60 miles from the nearest base. At a gas station, a local officer spotted her military-issued gun. Without asking questions, he drew his weapon and aimed it at her head. She raised her hands, but he didn't recognize the signal. He ordered her down, grabbed her comms tag, and demanded, "Who the hell are you?" Jordan couldn't answer. Her identity was classified. Even the pickup contact only had coordinates, not her name. With no way out, she did the only thing that might save her. She apologized. Softly, she said, "I'm sorry for the confusion. I'll disarm. I mean no harm." That sentence was never written in any report, nor repeated in any debriefing, but to Jordan it left a scar, not on her body, but on her dignity. She wasn't angry at the gun pointed at her. She was angry at having to apologize while doing the right thing, and knowing that if her skin had been a different color, the officer wouldn't have reacted in fear. Telling the story in a quiet room with a military advisor, Jordan wasn't looking for sympathy. She spoke evenly, every detail recalled like it was still part of protocol. But when she finished, she said only, "I don't want anyone else to have to bow their head just to leave alive." It never aired on TV. There was no footage, no civilian witness, no hashtag, but the advisor knew it mattered. The worst injustice isn't threat, it's being forced to accept it as duty. And Jordan, in her silence, was finally undoing that through truth. Afternoon light crossed the window, casting Jordan's shadow on the table. She sat upright, hands clasped, eyes fixed on a small silver badge, one no one had ever known she carried. Across from her, the advisor waited, not pushing, listening with the patience of someone who's heard many truths released slowly. Jordan spoke not to explain, but to say what she had carried for 3 years. "I was special ops, in uniform, with ID, but I stayed quiet. If I spoke, the mission would have been exposed. Others could have died." Her voice didn't shake. It held the weight every soldier knows. Sometimes silence isn't fear, but protection. She remembered the officer's eyes, not scanning for threat, but used to seeing people with no right to answer. She remembered the hand on the gun, her cheek against the glass, her ID pinned under armor where she couldn't reach it. For a moment she considered speaking, but in that second came the names, maps, and call signs of 2 agents in deep cover. One word could end it all, so she stayed silent. No one heard the apology. No one knew how long it took to lift my head again. She said, eyes still on the badge. "I'm not telling this for pity. I'm telling it because if someone with proof had to say sorry, how many with nothing have stayed quiet their whole lives?" The advisor watched her, not surprised, only certain. He had known the story, but needed to hear it from her, not for evidence, for readiness. "So you choose to speak now?" he asked quietly, like a commander asking if she was ready to return. Jordan nodded. That nod in the still room was her signal. No declaration, no recording, just the truth. This time, she would not be silent, not for revenge, but so no one else would have to carry what she had hidden. The advisor exhaled slowly and laid his hand on the badge between them. He didn't lift it, only held it, as if taking responsibility. "This time," he said, "no clearance needed. Just the truth kept in its right shape." He knew the truth doesn't always need a stamp. In Jordan's world, putting it in writing might strip its core. Dignity held through the worst. What she gave wasn't data to verify, but memory to preserve, so others don't go through it without knowing they can speak. Jordan didn't reply. She flipped the badge, revealing a code only a few could read. She didn't say where she was going, but as she stood, the light had shifted, and the old man who had seen many leave battles quietly understood. She wasn't leaving the fight. She was choosing how to fight. This time, not with weapons, but with truth. Not to expose, but to place it in front of anyone still unsure that the system needs a shock to see itself. She didn't need to be clear. She needed the memory to stay, so that next time, when someone is stopped for standing too tall, someone might remember, this has happened before, and it was told truthfully. Unlike the closed-door hearings typical in law enforcement, this time Custer stepped into a room packed with people, not just members of the oversight board, but also community representatives, law students, former officers, and residents from over-policed neighborhoods. He stood in the light, with no barrier, no escort, and no defense attorney. The microphone clicked on, red light glowing. Custer looked around, not avoiding the stares from the audience. Some faces he had seen during patrols. Others were strangers, but their eyes carried the same message. Say it now. This time, don't leave anything out. He didn't read from a script. His voice was hoarse from sleepless nights, but clear enough to still the room. With his first words, I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to say what I should have said long ago. Not because I stayed silent, but because at one point I truly believed she deserved it. The room tightened. Some clenched fists, some looked up. Others dropped their gaze. Custer kept going without pause. I used to think Jordan had an attitude. When she stood tall, didn't flinch, didn't apologize, I thought she was looking for trouble. I didn't say it, but in my head, I nodded along with Cole. I believed someone who behaved like that needed to be put in place to remember who controlled the scene. The silence hit harder than outrage. Custer looked toward the front rows, where a group of black women sat side by side, hands gently resting on each other's shoulders, steadying themselves. He knew they didn't need an apology. They needed truth, not wrapped in phrases like procedural error or defensive reflex. What's kept me awake, he continued, isn't that I stayed silent. It's that I believed I was right. I believed she needed a lesson, and that belief, not any command, not any weapon, was the most dangerous thing I ever carried in uniform. A council member asked, So why do you think you reacted that way? Custer inhaled, placing a hand lightly on the table as if to steady his breath. Because I was trained to control situations. Every unusual move, every non-compliant tone, every stare longer than 3 seconds was coded as a threat. I was taught to predict escalation, but I was never taught how to tell the difference between a situation and a person. That sentence earned no applause, but it was written down, word for word, by those seated in the back, people holding notebooks not to report news, but to carry forward what an entire generation of officers needs to hear. Power doesn't come from predicting what will happen. It comes from seeing someone and not mistaking them for what we fear. At the end of the hearing, Custer didn't walk straight out. He stood there, meeting every stare, even the slow head shakes. He didn't dodge them. He didn't leave with his head held high, but he didn't lower it either, because he knew this wasn't the place to preserve dignity. It was the place to return the truth, as it truly was, before he twisted it through blind conviction. And when he stepped down from the stand, they understood he was no longer a witness. He had become living proof of a system that trained silence through classes labeled operational safety. For the first time, someone inside said plainly, the real crack wasn't in the mistakes, it was in the mindset that shaped them. As the hearing ended, reporters crowded around Custer on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but one made him pause. A young reporter, calm and clear, asked, Do you think you should lose your job? Custer didn't look at the cameras or the reporter. He looked at his hands, hands that once held a flashlight pointed at a woman's calm face. Then he said, voice steady and bare, I should have lost the silence first. That answer didn't trend. It didn't go viral, but everyone there remembered, because it didn't deflect or protect a reputation. It admitted what the system always denied, that silence isn't absence of action, it's a form of consent, a way injustice survives. And what needs to be dropped first isn't the badge or the gun, but the habit of looking away. Some in the crowd nodded, not in agreement but in recognition. Maybe they hadn't been officers, but they had held power to ignore, to stay quiet. His answer, brief as it was, made them ask, what had I kept, and what did I lose by not speaking up? Later, a local station replayed one short clip from the hearing. No effects, no commentary, just his final words. That day, I saw someone stand tall while I looked away. It aired only once, but in civics classes it was written on whiteboards to open discussion. Some unit leaders printed it on the back of evaluation cards. No orders were given. The sentence detached from the speaker and entered collective memory. Custer gave no follow-up, no interviews, no statements. But the look in his eyes at the end of his testimony stayed with people, not the look of guilt, but of someone who had stayed silent, once believed he was right, and now couldn't go back. On a small forum for former officers, a colleague wrote, "I used to think he was soft. Now I know, facing the truth without a shield is harder than surviving a chase." A high school student titled her essay, "Silence is a position, standing up is a choice." Her final line quoted Custer, "Without his name. Names fade, what changes people is the image of someone bowing, not from shame, but because they finally knew what they'd missed." And so the hearing didn't end with verdicts or penalties, it ended with a truth long overdue. In a society that treats silence as discipline, one bowed head, saying it should have been lifted sooner, became the first step toward redefining what responsibility means. The opening day of the congressional hearing on law enforcement reform did not begin with bold declarations or statistics. Instead, an elderly legislator, who had remained silent during past discussions on systemic bias, read a single question aloud to the chamber. The term reasonable suspicion. What does it mean when the person in front of you doesn't look like you, doesn't dress like you, and doesn't fear you the way you're used to seeing? The room fell into a pause, not because the question was new, but because for the first time, one of the most fundamental concepts in enforcement training was being publicly challenged at its core. It wasn't about procedural errors, it was about the foundation itself, whether reasonableness in suspicion is truly fair when it's shaped by the instincts of someone raised within unchecked assumption. The hearing continued with testimonies from scholars, lawmakers, and those who had been targeted by the very principle in question. But no one could deny what society had begun to admit, that the flexibility in interpreting the law had sometimes become a gateway for personal biases to seep in and legitimize themselves. One of the most powerful statements came not from a victim, but from a white attorney dressed in a light gray suit with graying hair and a calm, polished voice. Invited to speak, he brought no files, no slides. He simply shared an example. "I walked into a shopping mall at 8 p.m. wearing a hoodie, earbuds in, unshaven. The security guard greeted me, said nothing." He paused, then continued, "If a black teen did that, dressed the same, moved the same, he wouldn't be called relaxed. He'd be labeled suspicious. He didn't accuse, but he made it clear when the law is filtered through an unequal lens, it stops being law. It becomes a selective tool, turning the same act into something harmless for one person and a threat for another." His words were quoted repeatedly in legal forums not because they were novel, but because someone with privilege had chosen to admit that privilege was tilting the scales. And that, more than any argument, was the catalyst the hearing needed. As the petitions, legal briefs, and proposed amendments were printed in thick stacks, a thin envelope reached the chairperson's desk. It wasn't from an advocacy group. It wasn't signed by a lawyer, just 3 handwritten words in the top corner. Jordan Lane. She didn't attend. But inside was a single page, white paper, blue ink. The opening line was brief. "I didn't come to speak, but if today we're redefining anything, please start by remembering what fairness was meant to be." The last line of the letter was handwritten, unsigned. "Justice doesn't need to win. It needs to be defined right." The chair didn't read it aloud. He simply held it up for the room to see, and that silence made the letter more final, more powerful than any petition. Outside Congress, students held signs, "Redefine justice, not just practice it. No chance, just steady eyes." One young woman lifted her sign higher, not for the cameras, but for the passers-by, as if asking, if justice needs repeating to be understood, maybe it's time to rewrite it, clearly, from the beginning. After 4 tense days of testimony, the Federal Judiciary Committee handed out a draft, no press, no remarks. The title read, Amendment to Identity Verification Outside Due Process. It proposed ending reasonable suspicion as enough to justify body searches. From now on, every forced stop required a clear reason, in writing, reviewed every 30 days, no exceptions, no vague instincts. The new draft didn't strip officers of authority, but it tightened the line between instinct and duty. One clause read, No person shall be searched or stopped without a reason clearly defined, recorded at the time and reviewed independently. It was dry language, but for those who had followed the case, from Jordan's composure to Cole's words to Custer's admission, it meant change that once felt generations away. At a law school up north, students chalked the draft on a wall, circling the lines they'd fight to protect. A professor told his class, "Change starts when someone rewrites how we search a bag on the street." The final line of the draft wasn't legal language, but it echoed loudest. Silence is no longer a reason, and suspicion is no longer a privilege. A photo of the draft hitting the table was shared with one caption: "Sometimes rewriting a single line is how a society lifts its head." Soon, people stopped calling it by its formal name. They called it something simpler: the law of looking again. Not the gaze of power, but the mirror of a society learning to see itself, finally, with clarity. After the reform bill was announced and vague legal phrases were replaced with specific accountability, a respected civil organization submitted a petition to erect a statue of Jordan Lane. They proposed placing it in front of the city's central police station, the place where the first video was filmed and the protests began. Their presentation emphasized that the statue was not about personal glory, but about a society waking up from believing silence was safety. The design was simple: no pedestal, no facial details, just a standing figure, hands holding bag straps, head slightly raised, located at the exact spot where she had once been questioned. A bronze plaque would bear her words to Congress: "Justice doesn't need to win arguments, it just needs to be redefined correctly." They sent her a request through the only known contact. She wasn't expected to attend, only to silently agree. But a week later, a handwritten letter arrived. Jordan declined. "I'm grateful," she wrote, "but if a statue is built, people will assume something extraordinary happened. It didn't. I just stood still, and I don't want others who do the same to be treated like exceptions." Her final line stopped the effort completely. "I don't need to stand in the city if it makes others believe silence is rare." Jordan wasn't rejecting remembrance, but she feared making dignity seem exceptional. If silence is carved in stone, it becomes a performance, not an act anyone can claim. Since then, she declined all interviews and honors. For her, stepping back was about keeping the ordinary intact, letting others know that doing the right thing isn't heroic, it's human. One student chose Jordan for a school essay on inspiring figures. She wrote, "If I made a statue, I wouldn't use stone. I'd teach people how to see someone silenced, not as a symbol, but as a person." Jordan left no public trace. But in law classes and civic lectures, her story is taught not as confrontation, but as quiet defiance. Her words now close many conferences. "I don't want people to mistake silence for rare bravery. Sometimes it's just the only thing left when no one is listening." After support surged for the draft bill and rare reforms in enforcement policy, a major network invited Jordan to appear on a special called "Silence That Changed Things." She was not asked to explain or reenact, only to share the journey that made the system rethink itself. The show was scheduled for prime time, with 20 million expected viewers. The invitation, sent through her legal contact, got a reply 2 days later. "I won't retell it. What happened doesn't need repeating." The team said nothing. They understood Jordan's silence wasn't a refusal, it was resolve. She believed truth didn't need repeating to matter. Its power came from staying steady, not staying visible. Weeks later, her online presence vanished. No farewell, no last post. Reports said she left the state with no trace, no license plate, no video, no paperwork. Some guessed she was in a quiet town near a base. Those who knew her didn't mourn her absence. They called her the woman with the canvas bag, or the one who didn't need to shout. Her silence left space for reflection, not fame. Her last known words appeared in a note from the day the police chief resigned. "I don't want to be remembered as someone who got hit, but as someone who didn't fall." That line, unsigned and unquoted, was printed on the back of the National Police Reform Report, not as a citation, but as a reminder. In police academies, final exams have shifted. Recruits were now asked, What would you not do to protect someone's dignity? In ethics classes, students asked, what if standing tall makes someone look guilty? Jordan's name faded, but her choices shaped new questions. She didn't leave a legend, she left a way forward, truth carried in silence, and justice reshaped by those who stay to witness. At a federal police academy just outside the Capitol, where hundreds of officers are trained each year for local units across the country, a seasoned instructor decided to change the way his first lecture began. No formal pledge, no roll call. He walked in, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote 5 bold words on the board. Distinguish reflex from prejudice. The class fell silent, waiting. They were used to opening lessons on threat detection, hand control techniques, and report protocols, but today the instructor didn't touch the manual. He looked around the room and said calmly, "Today, we won't study how to control a situation. We'll study how not to let bias control us." He drew a line down the board. One side read, "Necessary reflex for survival." The other, "Reflex preserved by unquestioned habit." Then he asked, "When you see a white man walking fast at night, what do you think? When it's a black man, do you think the same?" One cadet leaned forward. His name was Alvarez, son of a former officer, raised believing the badge was a symbol of justice. He didn't challenge, didn't hesitate. He asked, "How can we tell what's professional instinct and what's prejudice? Sometimes they blend." The room quieted. Not from tension, but because no textbook ever prepared them for that question. The instructor placed his hand on the desk, then replied, "That's a valid question, and there's no simple answer, but there is one sign." He wrote one more line under the title. "If your reflex changes with skin color, it's a habit, not instinct." His voice softened, pressing meaning into memory. Instinct is what protects you from weapons, explosions, or fire. But when you feel threatened just because the person in front of you doesn't look like you, unarmed, non-aggressive, that's not instinct. That's a habit built from moments that were never questioned. No one moved. Some cadets wrote notes. Others froze mid-sentence, perhaps recalling every time they'd reacted without questioning the root of it. The instructor paced slowly. "We train you to react quickly. But from now on, I want you to learn another skill. Pause long enough to ask what's driving you, a real threat or an unchecked habit." He underlined 3 more words, condition suspicion, then said, "I'm not asking you to stop being cautious. I'm asking you to place conditions on your caution. Let it start from behavior, not skin color, not clothing, not hair. Let it come from evidence, from reason, not inherited fear." When the class ended, no one rushed to leave. Some quietly took photos of the board. One cadet whispered to a friend, "If the first lesson is about bias, maybe the last will be about forgiveness." The instructor heard, didn't turn back, just nodded slightly. He knew real change doesn't start with the right answer. It starts when someone dares to ask the right question. And that began today. With chalk on a board, 5 words, and a classroom relearning what seemed too basic to be taught. Reflexes aren't always right. And justice begins with self-correction. When the session ended, the instructor gave no closing remarks, no summary questions. He simply walked to the control panel and advanced to the final slide. The lights dimmed, and the projector cast its glow on the wall. No graphs, no statutes, just one photograph. Jordan Lane stood upright outside a grocery store. A flashlight hit her face. In the glass behind her, the faint outline of an officer held her against a brick wall. But her gaze didn't shake. No anger, no fear, just calm and direct, fixed on the man who had shoved her. No flinch, no apology. The photo had no sound or motion, but the training room fell silent. The image alone said what no manual had taught. Some moments define moral clarity without needing words. No one needed to be told who she was. They had studied the policy reforms she set in motion, but this was the first time they saw the stillness that started it. Under the photo was one line: "Silence is not the absence of fear. It is knowing what must not happen again." A woman stopped taking notes. A veteran nodded quietly. Around them, others recognized the weight of not having spoken before, of once thinking silence meant safety. The instructor shut off the projector. No one moved. A student whispered, "If she had screamed, maybe we'd have missed that look. Another took a photo of the blank screen where the light had just been. The session ended in silence, not avoidance, but awareness. No lecture, no recap, just the realization that real courage can be quiet. That silence, held in full view, can say, "This must not be repeated," and that next time someone stands still like that, someone else needs to stand with them, so they're not left alone in it. In a public high school ethics class in the suburbs, the teacher began the session with a clip barely 10 seconds long. No sound, no subtitles, just a slowed-down shot from a surveillance camera outside a grocery store, a frame once cut from the official footage due to poor quality and unclear resolution, but in slow motion, it revealed a moment most viewers had missed: Jordan being shoved against the brick wall by Cole. It wasn't the push or the blood from her temple that left the class silent. It was her eyes, wide open, unblinking, fixed on him. There was no resistance, no surrender, just a gaze that didn't turn away. The clip ended, the screen went black, the room stayed quiet. The teacher wrote a single question on the board: "What would you have done if you were there?" The clip was later included in ethics lessons across several schools, not to condemn the police, but to teach about reflex and choice. There was no legal analysis, no political angle. The lesson didn't tell students to oppose law enforcement, but instead presented them with a scenario without a right answer. If you had been the witness, the one recording, the one by the shelf who saw that gaze, what would you have done? Not every student answered, but many wrote thoughts in their journals, ideas they might never have considered years before. One 11th grade student wrote, "I used to just watch. Now, I don't want to watch. I want to stand." The class agreed to post that line on the school bulletin board. It was a reminder that what haunts people most isn't what they did wrong, but what they failed to do when something wrong was right in front of them. A week later, the city's police department issued an official decision. Cole Strickland was terminated, stripped of all enforcement authority, and banned from reinstatement in any law enforcement agency nationwide. The 4-page document ended with one line the public would remember: violation of ethical conduct standards, reflex based on prejudice, and unjustified use of force in public. Jordan's gaze, slowed down in a voiceless clip, became a reminder that what is right doesn't always arrive as a spoken word. Sometimes it begins when someone chooses not to look away and holds their gaze long enough to see that at times, silence itself is the deepest form of courage a person can choose. About 3 months after Jordan's gaze was introduced into the school curriculum, online sharing of the clip began to fade. It stopped appearing in top searches, vanished from major video platforms. It was no longer viral in the usual sense. But for those who had watched it, it never left, because what they saw wasn't just a video, it was a moment that couldn't be replayed. People stopped sending the link, they told the story instead. Some remembered her unblinking eyes. Some, her hair fell slightly by her ear. Others, the barely audible breath before she hit the wall. And all agreed they had never seen someone hold such calm, enough to shake her abuser, not through resistance, but through not breaking. The clip didn't need to trend. It had already reshaped how people thought about instinct, silence, and the line between vigilance and bias. At a year-end ethics forum, a teacher from Kentucky recalled showing the clip of Jordan. "My students don't call it an incident anymore," she said. "They call it the moment you can't stay silent in front of." It wasn't about Cole's actions anymore, but about everyone else's. The bystander, the one filming, the one unsure of what to do. The question shifted from "what did he do?" to "where would I have stood?" In Chicago, a senior wrote their final paper on how one silent moment forced a society to listen. No quotes, no footage, just a description of her gaze. The last line read, "Some people don't fall, so we remember not to nod at what's wrong." That clip, though gone from platforms, stayed in classrooms and conversations, not because of what it showed, but because of how it changed what people asked. It wasn't just a case anymore, it was a mirror. Jordan never returned to speak again. She didn't need to. Her silence, her steadiness, turned into a new kind of lesson, one that taught future officers not just when to act, but when not to look away. Not for justice's sake, but for dignity's. 1 month after Cole was officially dismissed and system-wide reforms began to ripple from training academies to legislative halls, Custer wrote a letter to an address he wasn't sure still existed. No subject line, no specific recipient. He didn't expect a reply. The letter wasn't to apologize or to seek forgiveness. It was a note to remind himself. He opened with a memory he had long tucked away. "I still remember the first time I used force," he wrote. A young man stepped back, slower than I expected. I grabbed him, pushed him against the hood, and pressed my knee into his left shoulder. He let out a groan, not resisting, just asking, "Did you have to do that?" Custer hadn't answered him then, but in his head there had been quiet satisfaction. Back at the station, his supervisor clapped his shoulder, said, "Quick response, firm, good instincts." Custer said nothing, but felt relieved. In that environment, forcefulness was seen as control, and control was always praised. Looking back now, he wrote, "No one told me I was wrong, but no one asked the kid if he saw any justice in what I did. He never mentioned the boy's name. Didn't know how he got home, but that sound, the groan, the sense of dominance, never really faded. He didn't cast himself as a victim. Instead, he admitted, I used to think strength meant holding your ground, holding posture, holding your voice louder, holding a stare that made people back off. But now I know sometimes you hold space so someone else can stand, not because they're weak, but because some things deserve room, not pressure." He didn't name Jordan directly. He called her the one who didn't look away, not to avoid her name, but to honor the way she had chosen not to become a symbol. What he remembered most wasn't her hitting the wall, but how she neither rose to fight nor lowered herself to beg. She simply stood still, and everything else stopped around her. He recalled another night in a black neighborhood just after sunset. A child playing outside stepped back inside at the sound of sirens. Cole laughed. "They know what's up." Custer hadn't laughed, but he hadn't said anything either. "And now," he wrote, "that's the silence I regret most, not because I agreed, but because I let them think I did." At the end of the letter, he wrote plainly, "I don't expect you to remember me. I don't need forgiveness. I just need to remember every time I stood on the wrong side, so next time I'll know where to stand." Custer folded the letter without sealing it, left it at a transit point once used for internal documents. Maybe it wouldn't reach Jordan, maybe she no longer lived there, but that didn't matter. He hadn't written it for anyone to read. He wrote it so he wouldn't forget that some things must not repeat, and the only person who can stop them is the one who once stayed silent. The letter was later found in the archive of an organization advocating police reform. It remained untouched, as part of a program called Reflective Dialogue among law enforcement generations. At the top, they quoted a single line from the letter. "It wasn't a lack of courage that kept me quiet. I had just grown too used to calling silence professional." After many sleepless nights, Custer printed the letter again. This time, the final version. He added one last sentence. "That day, I didn't stop Cole, but I won't let there be a second time." He read it over, once, twice, then folded it again. No envelope, no address, no delivery. Instead, he walked out back, lifted the lid of the old steel bin once used for burning training papers. The November wind rustled the dry leaves underfoot, but his hands didn't shake. He placed the letter at the bottom. A match struck. The flame wasn't loud, but it wasn't slow either. Each line, each confession, each late realization turned to ash. He didn't look away, and he didn't bow his head. Only after the paper was gone did he whisper the last line, the one he knew would stay with him even after the fire. "Justice isn't what we wear. It's what we refuse to let happen again. Not a badge, not a rank, not a policy. Justice is the line we don't let be crossed again." He didn't need anyone to hear it, but from that moment on, he knew. Every choice, every silence would answer to that sentence. Next week, Invited to speak at a training session at his former academy, Custer didn't talk about himself. He didn't mention Jordan or Cole. He gave a short lecture on the gap between reacting and reflecting, then asked one question. When the moment comes, will you act because you can, or pause because you should? In a student's notebook that day, one line was written down, the same one burned but not forgotten. Justice isn't what we wear, it's what we refuse to let happen again. No name beneath it, just a long line drawn under, like a boundary. From then on, a small paper sat behind Custer's office door, where only he saw it each morning. Plain white, black ink, no decoration. That same sentence at the top, and below in smaller script, written so I won't forget, burned so I won't be proud. He didn't call himself a hero. He knew he was late, that he'd been wrong, that he'd stayed silent, but now he no longer waited for justice to be defined. He drew his line not in law, but in the space between action and excuse, between fearing mistakes and fearing admitting them. When asked if you could go back, what would you do differently, he replied simply, I don't need to go back. I just need to make sure it never happens again. The message wasn't shared, but the officer who received it, saved it, printed it, and pinned it to his desk. Now, every time he stepped out of his car to approach someone, his hand touched his chest pocket, not to check his weapon, but to make sure he still remembered why he should be trusted. Custer never retold Jordan's story in public, but his voice slowed, his decisions changed, and people began to see some lessons don't need to be shouted, they're taught. How someone quietly starts doing things differently, in the boundaries they redraw, and sometimes it all begins with one sentence written down, then burned, but carried still in what we choose never to repeat. Because justice isn't for display, it's what we refuse to allow again. The training session that day began like any other in the second-year police cadet program. A simulated scenario was staged on the practice ground. A person playing the suspect stood beside a car, while two instructors acted as officers handling the scene. Everything seemed routine until one deviation appeared. One of the officers began a body search with a demeanor that was threatening and off protocol. His gaze, his approach, even the tone in his voice, everything signaled something beyond professional conduct. But since it was a drill, and the one crossing the line was a trainer, most cadets stayed silent, or told themselves it was probably a psychological test. Except for the girl from years ago, the one who had written to the mayor back in 8th grade, now a second-year cadet, she couldn't pretend not to see it. She looked, then turned to her peers. One of them glanced back and gave a small shake of the head, as if to say, let it go, but she couldn't. She took a step forward, her voice steady, though not loud. If we look away now, then out there, I won't be just another person. I'll be someone used to turning away. The words halted the group. Some frowned. Others looked toward the instructor for a response, but she kept going. I'm not against training. I'm against being trained to accept what's wrong, so we grow numb to it. Because if we get used to it, we'll stop seeing what's wrong at all. And when that happens, the first people hurt will be us, because we'll have lost our sense of what's right. No one interrupted. No one laughed. She stood tall, her eyes not fixed on anyone in particular, as if speaking to her future self, the one who would wear the uniform, make decisions, and need to remember where she started. The trainer walked toward her directly. Are you choosing to go against your team? She answered without hesitation. I'm choosing not to go against my conscience. Time seemed to slow, as if everyone was silently measuring themselves. Her answer didn't feel defiant. It wasn't forced to sound righteous. It was simply a decision, clear, calm, and enough to show that this cadet had held on to what had once moved her to write that letter, the refusal to accept what's wrong, no matter her age or the system she's in. The trainer didn't argue. He turned to the review panel and nodded. Scenario complete, personal stance noted, no point deduction. Then he looked back at her and gave a quiet nod, an unspoken affirmation. As she returned to her seat, the eyes on her had changed. No longer pitying, but something harder to name, a recognition that someone who can say no today might be exactly who they'll need tomorrow, to be the one to pause when no one else sees the line being crossed. When the drill ended, no one was asked to speak. There was no formal debrief. But as she sat back down, unexpectedly applause rose from the right side of the room. The first to clap was a cadet known for his silence, someone who always followed orders without fuss. Then 3 more, then 7, and soon nearly the whole class joined. The sound wasn't loud, wasn't perfectly timed, but it was real, and it carried more weight than any scripted praise ever could. It wasn't in agreement with her opinion. It was the reflex of those who recognized that someone among them had just done what they thought was impossible, spoken up when everything around demanded silence. She didn't wait for approval. She didn't seek attention, but with that simple choice, she set a new threshold in a classroom once built on compliance. In the quiet that followed the applause, she looked toward the back of the room, where a line from the last lesson remained on the board, distinguished between reflex and bias. Maybe she had proved it, that reflexes can be retrained, and bias, when challenged directly, loses its place as assumed truth. That afternoon, she sat alone in the academy's back courtyard, where maple trees turned with the season. On her lap, she opened her old notebook to a page from 8th grade, where she once wrote, "I'm afraid I'll grow up and be seen as a threat." The tilted handwriting, ink trembling with fear, was still there, a younger self she had since outgrown. She thought of the times she'd avoided a police officer's gaze in a store, of her mother's warnings not to wear hoodies at night, of how she used to rush past security stops just to avoid a cold stare. Now she wore the uniform, but instead of making others lower their heads, she chose to be the reason they could stand tall. A classmate sat beside her, said nothing, and placed a small slip of paper on her notebook. It read, "Silence is sometimes safe, but speaking changes the world." She smiled without saying thanks. She knew he didn't need it. He needed to know her action wasn't just a statement. It was the start of another kind of reflex. From that day, every training scenario included a new section. What ethical factor should be considered? She didn't demand it. A professor proposed it. And the only reason recorded was because someone reminded us of the question we forgot to ask. Change started small. A look that didn't turn away. A question was asked without hesitation. An answer not meant to win, but to stay awake. And for the first time in that classroom, it was clear. Strength didn't always come from volume, but from standing firm in what's right, even when those around you still hesitated. The girl who once wrote in fear she'd be seen as a threat had become someone others now saw themselves through, not because she shouted, not because she was recognized, but because she chose at the right moment not to be silent. And in a society still learning how to listen again, sometimes one person like her is enough. There was no major campaign launched. No hashtag made it to the top of any trend. Yet, in the quiet corners of the city, places long accustomed to silence, small signals began to ripple out without a call. It wasn't a wave, but a quiet, smoldering current. No one raised their voice, but everyone began to look more closely. In a worn-down apartment complex on the west side, where a controversial random search had been quietly buried years ago for lack of evidence, a middle-aged man walked into the local legal aid group's meeting and asked to speak. He brought no documents. He just recounted a night he stood on his second-floor balcony, saw everything happen, closed the curtain, turned off the lights, and told his wife, "Let's not get involved." Now he was recounting it, not to accuse, but to confess. "I once chose not to see, because seeing meant doing something, and I didn't have the courage. But today, I'm telling it, so I don't keep living like a blind man in the light." In a quiet corner of a senior living facility, a white-haired woman, hands trembling around a teacup, mentioned a video she once recorded 3 years back. "Back then, I saw someone get stopped right at the alley entrance. They pushed him down, shoved his head against a utility pole. I pulled out my phone and recorded nearly a minute, but when he lifted his head and looked my way, that look scared me. I was afraid they knew I filmed. I deleted the clip before anyone else could see. Then I pretended nothing happened." She paused, then continued softly. I don't remember his face anymore, but I remember how much my hands shook when I pressed delete. Now I keep everything I see, not to post it, just to know I was there, and so I don't erase myself again. Her story never made the news, but a few days later, her granddaughter, a journalism student, wrote an essay titled, "The Memories We Once Deleted and How They Returned to Save Us." It was first shared within her school, then spread to local community groups. No photos, no tags, but anyone who read it knew it wasn't about one person. It was about us. In a small riverside church, usually quiet except for weekend services, a corner wall was now covered in black and white portraits. Faces of people wrongfully accused, falsely detained, or treated like criminals for not resembling those who questioned them. Each photo had a short caption, the date, location, and a quote from a report or personal account. Some placed a hand on a companion's shoulder. Others closed their eyes, took a deep breath. A few just stood in silence, then pulled out their phone and messaged someone. I used to think this had nothing to do with me. Maybe that's why it kept happening. The church ran no campaign, but the woman who led it, a pastor, once said during a sermon, "Prayer is inward, but memory must be placed where others can see, not to hurt, but to remember and not forget again." In a small bookstore downtown, the owner set up a special shelf labeled "What Wasn't Allowed to Be Written." On it were old books annotated by hand, pages once blacked out in classroom editions, passages deemed too sensitive for students. Visitors didn't have to buy. They read, sat in silence, then scribbled thoughts on blank slips placed beside each book. No one cleaned up, no one monitored, but day by day, the pile of notes thickened, not with outrage, but with quiet layers of recognition. In a roadside cafe, instead of a daily special, the barista wrote a question on the menu board. Who has been seen as a threat? Just for not resembling the one asking? Another day, how do we keep kindness without needing permission? Passers-by paused to read, sometimes without entering. The owner didn't need more customers, just more eyes that no longer looked away. In places once fitted with cameras to prevent trouble, new signs were posted. This area is not silent. We observe to protect each other. No rigid slogans, no loud declarations. Is a soft, firm statement. From now on, anyone abusing power must think twice, because people are no longer willing to close their eyes. When someone asked a retired officer, "What do you think made the system start to flinch?" he didn't hesitate. Not the headlines, not the hearings. It was the way people's eyes changed. He recalled going on a routine patrol with a group of cadets. On the way back, they stopped at an intersection where a car had been pulled over. One cadet suggested watching from a distance to evaluate the response. But instead of focusing on the stop, they looked at the eyes of the bystanders, people who said nothing, didn't lift phones, but stood tall, eyes unblinking, heads held high. Nothing like what they used to see from the generation before. That look, he said, makes those in power more cautious than any accusation, because accusations can be countered, but eyes that are no longer afraid, there's no reversing that. Change doesn't need a bang. It needs quiet moments that seem unremarkable, but happen everywhere. One person decides to speak up. One person chooses not to delete the clip. One person rewrites the curriculum. One writes a question instead of a command on the board. And one person, just one, stops looking away. A whole system once used to avoidance now faces a quieter threat than any inquiry. Awareness has returned. And when people start to look directly, every abuse of power finds itself exposed. No more invisible consent. No more shield called procedure. Only the gaze and silence that no longer fears. And when the scariest thing for a system is no longer the shout, but a community that has learned how to see clearly, then maybe justice has a real chance to begin without being declared. It only needs to be kept. In the eyes, in the mind, and in the way people stop looking away. On the old gray wall where Jordan's head was once slammed against the bricks, a faint dried patch of blood remained, unpainted and unmarked by any memorial. It was left as it was, a silent reminder. Etched beneath it, with small handmade nail marks, someone had carved a single line. She didn't fall, and that was enough. No one knew who carved it, but passers-by stopped. not out of curiosity, but because they sensed something true in its simplicity. She didn't fall. She wasn't turned into a victim to be mourned, nor a hero tasked with saving anyone. She stood, and from that stance the entire system shook, not because she won, but because no one could pretend not to have seen anymore. A story not to name a hero, but to name responsibility. Jordan never wanted to be the center of attention. She declined all honors, withdrew from the public, and left no address or trace. But what she left was a chain reaction, from a student speaking up in ethics class to a former officer confessing at a hearing, from a burned letter that never left memory to a new generation of cadets learning to ask questions before placing a hand on someone's shoulder. This story has no traditional hero. No statue was built. No one ended in glory. But each figure, from the girl who wrote a letter years ago to the elderly mother who kept the video, from the professor who began class with a line about reflexes, to the barista who scribbled a question on the menu board, each played a part in the shift. The redrawn image wasn't of a battle. It was a map of awakening, and that map needed no leader, only people awake enough to notice when something wrong was happening and not turn away. A lesson left by someone who didn't fall. Next to the elementary school near where it all happened, a class held a special session. The topic: describe a time you turned away. No grades, no submissions, just write or speak about a moment when silence was your choice. The stories surfaced like underground streams. Someone had once stayed quiet when friends teased a child. Someone had witnessed an elder being berated at a bus stop. Someone else had deleted a video out of fear. One student wrote, "I don't remember Jordan's face, but I remember looking at her and not turning away. Nothing more needed." The teacher nodded, then quietly placed it into the feedback box, the one that held more letters than any other that year. And maybe the most important thing is not to repeat. Jordan's story wasn't a tragedy, scripted for a grand ending. It was a small mirror, enough for society to ask itself, how many times have we turned away from the wrong? How often have we called silence neutrality? How many times have we chosen safety over standing with what's right? In the end, the justice everyone seeks doesn't begin with a judge's gavel. It begins in the moment when each person in their corner of life chooses to face what's in front of them and keeps their back straight under pressure. From the old wall, from the gaze of someone once held down, from the ungraded classroom, from the one who never needed to be remembered, something slow and steady was planted. Social dignity. It needs no leader. It doesn't depend on titles. It only needs to be repeated to every person who knows how to stand upright. And sometimes that is enough. Not because it ends all injustice, but because from that point on, no one can say, "I didn't know." No one can say, "I didn't see." And that is when real justice begins. Not with a verdict, but with a gaze that no longer looks away.